Hello and welcome to another Magic Duels gameplay. Today we are revisiting an old archetype, which is Black-Green Sacrifice. We haven't really played with it in a while, but we did get a whole bunch of new cards to play with. So at the heart of the deck we basically have Nantuko Husk, which allows us to sacrifice our creatures at any point at instant speed to make the Nantuko Husk bigger. And of course that not only can force through attacks that otherwise we couldn't make, but it also enables a whole bunch of synergies in this deck, and one of the more powerful synergies is in combination with Smothering Abomination, which says whenever we sacrifice a creature we get to draw a card. So when you have a bunch of expendable creatures you can play and then sacrifice to the Nantuko Husk and draw a card with the Abomination, you're quickly gonna run away with the game. So that's kind of the core of the deck, but it's also just an aggressive deck by itself, so we can just steal games by curving out and playing a Nantuko Husk, sacking a bunch of creatures and killing the opponent that way. So let's take a look at the entire deck here, starting out with the Blisterpod, a very important piece of the puzzle. So for single green we get a 1/1, that when it dies we get an additional 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token that we can also sacrifice by itself to add colorless mana to our mana pool. So essentially for 1 mana we get 2 creatures we can sacrifice, so that's a very good deal in this deck. And of course the Scion token itself we can sacrifice all by itself, so even if we just have a Smothering Abomination in play without a Nantuko Husk, we can still draw a card if we want to by sacrificing the Scion token. We also got a new removal spell in Fatal Push, which is perfect for this deck, since it's efficient, cheap, deals with problematic creatures, and also has Revolt, which we can very easily enable in this deck, since we can just sacrifice one of our own creatures and enable the Fatal Push to kill creatures with converted mana cost 4 or less, and even an Eldrazi Scion token we can just sacrifice at any point to enable Revolt. And we also have 2 copies of Bone Splinters to round out our 1 mana removal suite, which requires a creature to be sacrificed in order to cast it, and it can just destroy any target creature, which is a very powerful effect, but it is a sorcery, so it's not gonna be able to tag vehicles, for example. Then we have Carrier Thrall, which is very similar to Blisterpod. The only difference, it costs 1 mana more and it's a 2/1 instead of a 1/1, but also when it dies we get that same Scion token, so also just 2 creatures for 1 card. We also get Elvish Visionary, which is also a very expendable creature. For 2 mana we get a 1/1 that draws us a card, so we can just sacrifice the 1/1 creature to any of our effects, but we still get to draw cards, so we're not down on card advantage. So a very important card in this deck. Then we also have Scrapheap Scrounger, which is a nice addition from Kalitas. For 2 mana we get a 3/2 that can't block, so a nice aggressive creature for when we're on the beatdown plan. But we can also return the Scrapheap Scrounger from our graveyard to the battlefield by exiling a creature from our graveyard, which is not going to be a problem in this deck. We're going to have plenty of creatures that go to the graveyard, so the Scrounger can keep coming back and we can keep attacking with it or sacrificing it. Then we're also playing Smuggler's Copter, just a very powerful creature, not especially synergistic in this deck, but I like it because we can very easily crew it since it's just crew 1, so any of our 1 mana 1/1s or 2 mana 1/1s can easily crew the Smuggler's Copter, and it gives us an alternate way to attack the opponent in the air, and it also isn't vulnerable to sweeper effects, so kind of diversifying our threats there. We also have 1 copy of Evolutionary Leap, which used to be the centerpiece of the black-green or green sacrifice decks, but nowadays only 1 copy because decks got a lot faster, so you can't always afford to be sacrificing creatures for value to the Evolutionary Leap, but it is still a very powerful tool, especially against control decks, being able to sacrifice a creature and then find an additional creature. So basically whenever your creature has some sort of enter the battlefield ability or an ability when it dies, then Evolutionary Leap is providing a nice bit of value. We also have a Liliana Heretical Healer, which we can very easily flip into a Liliana Defiant Necromancer, and then we can make everyone discard a bunch of cards or return cards from our graveyard and do all sorts of stuff, and especially the ultimate is great in this deck. Then we also got Yahenni Undying Partisan from Aether Revolt, which is basically Nantuko Husk number 5 and 6, which also allows us to sacrifice our creatures at instant speed, and when a creature the opponent controls dies, we can put a +1/+1 counter on Yahenni, and also has haste, so can attack right away when we play it. We also have one copy of Fleshbag Marauder, which is very synergistic in this deck, but the card itself is not super powerful, also can't get rid of vehicles for example, so it did get significantly worse over time, but it's still nice to have access to one copy, also because we have Eldritch Evolution in this deck, so having those silver bullets to tutor for can be quite useful. Then of course Nantuko Husk, the card you basically always want in this deck. Allows for some very powerful attacks when you have a bunch of creatures you can sacrifice, and also just enables a lot of synergies. We have 2 copies of Reclamation Sage to combat those vehicle strategies, and can also take down a Sphinx's Tutelage for example. And we also have Eldritch Evolution, which I already mentioned a few times, so we basically have 4 copies of Reclamation Sage if you think about it that way. Speaking of Eldritch Evolution, there it is. So a 3-mana sorcery that makes us sacrifice a creature when we cast it, but then we get to search our library for a creature card with converted mana cost X, where X is 2 plus the converted mana cost of the sacrificed creature, and then we can put that creature into play, and Eldritch Evolution will often go find a Smothering Abomination in this deck, and we also have some silver bullets we can search for. Then we have Kalitas, Trator of Ghet, just a very powerful creature by itself. Also can make us sacrifice vampires or zombies, which we do have a fair amount of in this deck, and that can make the Kalitas larger and plays well with our removal spells, so we get those zombie tokens. And also a nice life-linking creature for when we're up against the burn decks, for example. And then probably one of the more important cards in the deck is Smothering Abomination. It's a 4-mana 4/3 flyer, so can actually close out the game quite quickly, and at the beginning of our upkeep we have to sacrifice a creature, so playing this on an empty board is not all that great. And whenever we do sacrifice a creature we get to draw a card, so this basically lets us draw 2 cards every turn as long as we can sacrifice some other creatures, and whenever we sacrifice a creature some other way we also get to draw a card, which is where this card really shines. And then finally we also have Treasure Keeper, which is also a sticky threat that when it dies we basically get to find another card with converted mana cost 3 or less from the top of our library and play it for free. So this will also often replace itself with another creature, so also plays well with all our sacrifice effects. So as you'll notice our curve is very low, so we're only playing 22 lands, 7 swamps, 7 forests, 2 Hissing Quagmire, 2 Woodland Cemetery and 4 Evolving Wilds, which can also enable a Revolt for Fatal Push. So that's the deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which is an easy mulligan. And this is a pretty easy keep. So we get to go turn 1 Blisterpod into turn 2 Scrapheap, into potentially Nantuko Husk, or we could just skip the Blisterpod and make sure we can play a Nantuko Husk on 3. Which I don't hate, but we are pretty favored in finding another untapped land in our next 2 draw steps. So I think I'll just curve out and hope to find another untapped land. Otherwise we still get to go Blisterpod into Scrapheap, which is not a bad curve either. Alright, Implement of Combustion from the opponent, so they must be on an improvised deck. And there's a Kalitas, so we could still decide to play the Quagmire here over the Scrapheap on 2. Definitely attacking for 1. So do we want to play the Quagmire or the Scrounger? Next turn our only play is potentially Bone Splinters, but we are putting a 3-powered creature into play, so I think it's still worth it here. So 3 mana for the opponent, 4 maybe with Improvise. They could also be holding on to a Metallic Rebuke, which we can easily play around by not playing any spells here, which we couldn't do anyways. So yeah, let's just attack for 4. And we might see the opponent sacrifice one of these implements end of turn just to draw a card, unless they have some expensive improvised cards they want to play. So nothing from the opponent, so might strongly indicate they have a Metallic Rebuke in hand. We are hitting them for 4 every turn, so it's not like they can keep holding on to those Metallic Rebukes without doing anything. Instead we see a Bastion Inventor, which would be a nice roadblock if it weren't for this Fleshbag Marauder we have in hand. And I don't think we have anything better we want to do here, so let's play the Flashbag. Sacrifice the Blisterpod. And get in for 3. Could have sacrificed the Flashbag itself and attacked for 4 here, but I think getting the 3/1 body is more important than attacking for 1. Sacrificing the Flashbag potentially plays around the sweeper effect a bit better, since then we still get the Cyan token afterwards. Instead we see a free jam Regent, another improvised card, but we do have a Bone Splinters for that. So if we find an untapped land here, that would be pretty awesome. And we do. Alright, so we get to play out our Kalitas, paying with our Cyan token. I think we want to do that, and then we can Bone Splinters to get a zombie token. Our other option is just playing a Husk and using Bone Splinters with a Cyan token attacking for 6. Yeah, that's probably just better. We don't get Kalitas and a zombie token, but we attack for 3 more this turn, and we get a Nantuko Husk in play. And I don't think the lifelink is very relevant at this point. So yeah, let's just play the Husk. And then Bone Splinters, sacrificing our Cyan token. And attack for 6, putting the opponent to 6. And unless they have something good here... Alright, Fatal Push is not bad. But it is targeting the Husk, so they are still taking 6 here. So their last card must be pretty good. And we also still have a Hissing Quagmire that could also get in there. They're sacking an implement, trying to find an answer here probably. Sacrifice a second implement. Let's see if they find something. And nothing, so they could just hold on to a removal spell here. So I think we just start by attacking for 6. And then we can follow up with Blisterpod and Nantuko Husk. Fatal Push on the Scrapheap, that's fine. If our opponent was at 5, then activating the Quagmire makes more sense. But I think here it's fine to just attack for 3. And then here we have the option of just playing the Blisterpod if we want to play around a Metallic Rebuke, and then getting back the Scrapheap end of turn rather than play out a Nantuko Husk. Walking Ballista is not bad here. Ballista for 3. But we can just Fatal Push and then get back the Scrapheap still. So our opponent is dead. And here they have to make sure to kill the Cyan token as well. So they're gonna kill the Blisterpod first, let the Cyan token appear, and also kill the Fleshbag Marauder. But now we can just get back our Scrapheap Scrounger, and their opponent is dead on board. So they can still kill the Cyan token here, but they're just deciding to deal us the last point of damage. Alright, so that Fleshbag Marauder was a pretty important play to get rid of the Bastion Inventor there. And we finally found the Smothering Abomination, which I can just play here, sacrifice a sign token to draw a card, and then attack our opponent for 3. Sacrifice, trigger. Alright, sweet. On to the next one. So we have a nice assortment of 2 mana plays, as well as a Blisterpod, as we see our opponent on probably a mono red deck with turn 1 Goblin Arsonist, which does actually match up quite well against our Blisterpod. So I actually think we'll just go ahead and get a Swamp here and play the Visionary on 2. Could also maybe play the Copter on 2, but I just want to make sure we can play a 2-drop on turn 2 rather than play the Blisterpod and hope we draw an untapped land. So let's see if our opponent has a good 2 mana play here. They do not, so they could be holding on to a removal spell. And we found a Husk, so playing the Visionary is appealing because it can trade with the Arsonist and also it draws us a card, which hopefully is a land. Playing the Copter plays around any removal spell and sets up for a nice turn next turn. Given that our opponent didn't play anything on turn 2, actually don't mind playing the Copter here. That way it kind of forces our opponent to keep up removal next turn, and if they don't, we get to play the Visionary, draw a card, crew the Copter, attack, see another card, which hopefully will find us the lands we need. And if we find a forest, for example, we could even play both the Blisterpod and the Visionary. 3 mana for the opponent, hits us for 1. Let's see if they have a good follow-up. Still nothing, so a removal spell seems likely, and we did not find a land here. So I think I'll start with playing the Visionary here. Try and draw a card. And there's a land. Alright, so I think we do try and crew the Copter here. So the best card our opponent could have here is the 3 mana instant that deals 3 to a creature and 2 to a player. Otherwise our opponent needs multiple removal spells for the Copter, since most of the 1 mana red removal spells only deal 2 damage. I guess they could also have a Lightning Axe plus Fiery Temper, but yeah, I think we do crew and try to get in there. Let's see if our opponent has that particular instant. They do. Alright, so that's unfortunate. But we do get to develop our board, and I don't think we want to Bone Splinters a Goblin Arsonist. So at some point we also have the option of using Eldritch Evolution to get a Kalitas, which can gain us a bunch of life against a mono red deck. Still nothing else from the opponent. And there's a forest, so we could actually Eldritch Evolution here for Kalitas if we wanted to. We could also just develop our board a bit, play Husk and Blisterpod before playing the Kalitas, which actually sounds better, since then next turn we could Eldritch Evolution for Kalitas and use Bone Splinters in the same turn. So yeah, let's, I think, attack for 1. And then play Blisterpod plus Husk. Shock end of turn on the Husk, so we're just gonna sacrifice the Blisterpod here. Want to keep the Visionary around to sacrifice to the Eldritch Evolution. Fiery Impulse on the Husk in response means if we want to save the Husk, we have to sacrifice the Elvish Visionary, which I don't think I want to do here. So I think I'll just let this happen. and say goodbye to our Nantuko Husk. We'll still get our Scion token. And we're still at 15, the opponent only has an Arsonist in play. Now an Avacyn's Judgment is gonna clear the board, so that's unfortunate. And they did also add a Battlements to the battlefield, so they could start attacking us with hasty creatures out of nowhere. So I guess next turn we'll just play 2 Scrapheap Scroungers. And then we can set up that Kalitas play next turn. Also, the nice thing about Kalitas is if we can exile the Arsonist, our opponent doesn't get to deal 1 damage. So yeah, let's just play 2 Scrap Heaps. That way if our opponent kills one of them, we still have the second one we can sacrifice. Touch of the Void is a very nice answer to Scrapheap Scrounger as it exiles it. And a Bowmat Courier now as well. The opponent's cards are lining up quite well against what we're doing. But next turn we'll get our revenge. So actually, now that we lost our other Scrapheap Scrounger, we can no longer get Kalitas and have something to sacrifice to the Bone Splinters. We could still get the Kalitas, but we won't be able to kill something right away. We will be attacking with the Scrapheap no matter what here, since it can't block. So the question here is, would we rather get the Kalitas, sacrificing the Scrapheap, or do we just play Thrall, play Blisterpod? Yeah, I think probably developing our board a bit is fine. And I don't think we'll be using the Bone Splinters yet, since saving it for the Kalitas is gonna be better. And now we have plenty of creatures we can sacrifice to the Bone Splinters next turn. And I will block the Bowmat Courier if it attacks. But I think I'll let the Arsonist through should it attack. As we see Aether Chaser, so they could have given the Aether Chaser haste by using the battlements. Instead, our opponent just attacks with the Arsonist, we'll take 1. And by getting Kalitas, our opponent's Bowmat Courier also becomes a lot worse. So I think now is a good time to go for it. And the question here is, do we get rid of the Arsonist or the Aether Chaser? Probably the Aether Chaser. So let's Eldritch Evolution away the Carrier Thrall. Get ourselves a Kalitas. Could also get Smothering Abomination here, but I think Kalitas is gonna be better. And then Bone Splinters away the Aether Chaser, sacrificing, I think, the Scion token. And now we get a zombie, and we can attack with both. And of course the lifelink is the important part here. They are attacking with both. So I think we just take the one from the Arsonist, otherwise a 3 damage burn spell plus 1 from the Arsonist could take down Kalitas. And just block the Bowmat Courier with the zombie token. So we get another zombie from Kalitas, Bowmat Courier gets exiled. And we're at 10, and the opponent has 2 cards in hand. So I don't think they'll be able to kill us from this point, as we'll be gaining life next turn. Another Aether Chaser. So that combined with maybe a Shock could theoretically take down Kalitas, but we can just sacrifice a zombie as well. Plus we found a Bone Splinters, which is gonna make it even easier. So now we can just attack with everyone. And let's do a quick count here, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So yeah, let's just go for it. I don't think there's anything our opponent can do here with only one card in hand. So Kalitas gets 2+1/+1 counters, and that's exactly 12. Alright, sweet. On to the next one. Let's take a look at our opener, which looks quite good here. Some cheap removal, some powerful threats. Our opponent leads off with a Renegade map. And here I think we can use the Evolving Wilds. We could save it for enabling Revolt for Fatal Push, and instead play the Swamp so we can play the Fatal Push right away here. But it's good to be mana efficient and get the tapped lands out of the way first. So next turn, probably gonna play the Copter. And then we can crew it on turn 3 with whatever creature we play, plus also keep up Fatal Push. And no play from the opponent turn 2. So if they were holding up removal spells here, playing the Copter also works out nicely. So let's see if our opponent has a good turn 3. A Drowned Catacomb. So I think I'll lead with a Scrapheap Scrounger here. Blisterpod is interesting. Yeah, I think I'll try and play the Scrapheap, and if it gets countered, we can still play the Blisterpod to crew the Copter. Opponent did not do anything, so that means they could potentially just be holding on to removal spells, which makes screwing the Copter not great here, so I think I'll just play out a Blisterpod and say go. And what do they do end of turn? Could be a Telling Time. Alright, so they're not doing anything. So next turn we can just attack with our other creatures if our opponent keeps up any removal. Instead it's a Radiant Flames, which will wipe our board, but is actually not the end of the world, since we do still get a Scion token from the Blisterpod dying, and we can still get the Scrapheap back from the graveyard. Opponent did play a Swamp, so they could still have a Fatal Push, which would be quite painful here since we don't have much going on. So I think, given that our opponent paused on turn 3, so it seems like they could easily have a Fatal Push. So I think we'll just play around it and instead just attack for 1 and play a Thrall and then get back the Scrapheap end of turn. Since losing the Copter here would be quite bad for us. And this way it forces our opponent to keep their instants up all the time. There we see a Kalitas, which I think we want to... Let's see. So this says non-token creatures. Alright, so this is actually fine. And an Aether Hub. So, if our opponent does have Fatal Push here, it would be quite bad if they get rid of our Carrier Thrall and exile it with Kalitas. So it might be better to sacrifice the Scion token to enable Revolt and then Fatal Push the Kalitas right now before our opponent has the opportunity to kill any of our creatures. So they don't get any zombie tokens, they don't get to exile any of our creatures, but it does mean we don't get to get back the Scrapheap end of turn. They were heavily signaling Fatal Push earlier, so I think playing around it is fine here. They could still be holding on to the Fatal Push, of course, so I think I'll still keep playing around it. So let's just attack for 2, play the Blisterpod, and get back Scrapheap. And I think I will play out my land, since we do have some interactions where we do need lots of mana with Evolutionary Leap, for example. And there's a Dark Intimations, which is fine. So opponent makes us discard a swamp. We have to sacrifice a creature, we'll sacrifice a Blisterpod. But they do get back their Kalitas, which is the bad part, of course. But we can get back our Scrapheap. Exiling a Blisterpod. So we do need to find an answer to that Kalitas, otherwise we're gonna be in trouble. But now we can finally attack with the Copter. Alright, Treasure Keeper's not bad. I think we want to still attack first with the Copter in case we find something better, although we do miss out on 1 damage that way. So maybe playing the Treasure Keeper first is worth it, since that extra damage when our opponent's at 17 could certainly matter, since we would be attacking for 9. So yeah, I think we do play the Treasure Keeper here. Keep up a swamp. In case we need to get back the Scrapheap somehow, we can still sacrifice a Cyan token. And we will loot with the Copter in case we draw into another Scrapheap Scrounger, then discarding that is of course good for us. Instead it's a Carrier Thrall, still gives us extra fuel in the graveyard to get back the Scrapheap potentially. Alright, so opponent's gonna play Kalitas and we need to somehow beat that. Which is not gonna be easy, since Kalitas does exile a lot of our creatures, which is not good for us. Second land, so they could be holding on to all sorts of removal spells now. Just a Renegade map. So yeah, I think this is where our opponent is gonna use a Fatal Push on the Copter. Found a Nantuko Husk, which is also not that great. So let's see, what are our options? If we crew the Copter, opponent pushes it. And we attack with everyone, that's kind of just a disaster. But also all these creatures with effects when they die basically get shut off by Kalitas. So we basically have to find an answer with the Copter to the Kalitas, but knowing our opponent has Fatal Push means they're gonna just kill the Copter and then get to untap with Kalitas and do bad things to us. So I think we're forced to try and find an answer with the Copter, but we know that's not gonna work, which puts us in an awkward place. And our opponent should not let us attack here, since we do get a free loot. And they do decide to Fatal Push. And unfortunately it's just a land. Do get to play the Husk. Keep up black mana. But if our opponent now has a sweeper, we get destroyed. And Disciple of the Ring is also pretty bad for us, since that can tap down our Nantuko Husk, for example. Opponent has 3 things they can sacrifice. Found a Hissing Quagmire. So if we attack, can sacrifice the Cyan token without too much trouble, since that's a token so it doesn't trigger Kalitas. But besides that, we don't have anything great we want to sacrifice. Otherwise we start giving our opponent a whole bunch of zombie tokens. But I do think we have to be proactive since we're not winning a long game. So let's attack with the Husk. Gets blocked by a zombie, so we'll sack the Cyan token. And play a Quagmire and say go. Telling time, end of turn. So yeah, if our opponent finds removal or even a sweeper, we will lose the game. And our outs at this point are Fatal Push, Bone Splinters. Fleshbag Marauder doesn't even do it. Renegade map and another Fatal Push targeting Nantuko Husk. Alright, let's, I guess, sacrifice the Husk to itself, not that it matters. And now Kalitas can pretty freely attack, since it can sacrifice a zombie. Not sure why the Disciple of the Ring is tapping anything down here. And do we find anything? Bone Splinters. Alright, so we're maybe not dead yet. So our opponent has 1, 2, 3, 4 cards in the graveyard. So I think we just have to pass a turn here. And then if our opponent glimmers, that's of course not good for us. But we do have the Quagmire to jump in front of Kalitas. But I think our win percentage now is below 1%. Our opponent basically has to make a mistake for us to still have a chance. I still don't know why our opponent is so keen on tapping down the Treasure Keeper, but I'll let it happen here. So let's activate the Quagmire. Opponent could tap it down with the Disciple once again, but that's one fewer card in the graveyard. So Kalitas hits us for 3. And Eldritch Evolution is interesting. So right now our opponent has 3 cards in the graveyard, so they can let us pay 6 more to resolve this Bone Splinters. So we still can't quite resolve it here. And playing Eldritch Evolution also doesn't make any sense. I think we just have to run it back with the Quagmire, hope our opponent taps it down again. Another Glimmer is bad for us, since if our opponent just finds an instant speed removal spell for the Quagmire, we also get destroyed. So it seems to me like they found an instant, but they didn't want to play it since they want to keep it for the Hissing Quagmire. Disciple again tapping down a Treasure Keeper for no apparent reason. Kalitas attacks, as well as the zombie. I will use a Quagmire, but I suspect our opponent will have removal for it this time. Unlicensed Disintegration. Alright, so opponent gets another zombie, hits us for 5. And they now have 4 instants or sorceries in the graveyard. Fatal Push. Alright, so we're still gonna lose here since our opponent's gonna get heaps of zombies, but we can at least try. So let's start by sacking the Thrall to destroy the Kalitas here. Opponent can counter it. Confirm Suspicions even, which seems suspicious to me, since now they're tapped out. And now we can Fatal Push the Kalitas, which I think is what we want to do here. Although, yeah, we can't kill the Disciple with Fatal Push anyways. So let's kill Kalitas. And we can Eldritch Evolution here, but I'm not even sure what we are supposed to get, since their opponent can just tap down our blockers and kill us next turn with their creatures. But I guess we can have a look. Probably just a Scrounger since it can't block anyways. And I guess we can get either a Smothering Abomination. Could also just get our own Kalitas. Yeah, let's get Kalitas. But we are just dead on board here. But at least we got to kill Kalitas. Opponent with Disintegration, now they have an artifact in play thanks to the Clue token. And just tapping down our Keeper, which finally is the correct play. Instead, they are flashing back Disintegration with Gear Hulk, and now we're dead. So yeah, that opposing Kalitas kind of shuts down our entire deck, which is one of the few hate cards in Magic Duels that hates on the graveyard. But still an interesting game. Playing around Fatal Push, I think, was what we needed to do in the early game. And that play with the Aether Hub was pretty interesting as well. But yeah, on to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which I think is a keep even though we don't have any black mana, but we do have a Copter which can potentially help us find one, as well as an Evolution. So, alright, there we go, Woodland Cemetery. So we get to go turn 1 Blisterpod, turn 2 either Copter or Thrall, into potentially Eldritch Evolution on 3. Opponent on Grixis Colors into Alchemist's Vial. So could be an improvise artifact deck, could be a Sphinx's Tutelage deck, who knows. And let's see, I think we do want to play the Copter here. Just threatens to deal more damage next turn. And then on 3 we can probably just play Yahenni. And I think Eldritch Evolution might get a Smothering Abomination if the time is right. As we see a key to the city. So our opponent could still be holding up a Metallic Rebuke here, since they have blue and 2 artifacts. So I think we just start by crewing here. See what happens. See if the opponent sacks the vial. They do not, so that also strongly indicates they might be up to something. So we'll attack. And we found a husk. So I actually don't mind getting rid of our Kalitas here. Double black, it's pretty pricey. Doesn't seem great in this kind of matchup. And we could just say go, but I would rather just make our opponent play the counterspell, and at that point I would rather have them counter another Smuggler's Copter. So let's see if they wanna go for it here. There it is, Metallic Rebuke. So the opponent will potentially be able to draw an extra card if they wanna pay 2 for the key to the city. And they do. They did tap their blue mana, so they might not have another Metallic Rebuke. So here I don't mind playing out the Yahenni, crewing the Copter and attacking for 5. But I think I'll play out the Swamp in case we find a 1 mana play with the Copter. Opponent could have a Fatal Push here for the Smuggler's Copter as well, but that's fine. And there's a Fatal Push, so let's sacrifice to Yahenni. And attack for 2. So next turn we could be looking at Eldritch Evolution to get a Smothering Abomination. Draws a whole bunch of cards. Although I guess we would need the Carrier Thrall in play in order to have a 2 mana creature we can sacrifice to the Evolution. Herald of Anguish. That's not bad. So that means we're gonna get a Fleshbag Marauder here. And let's see, do we want to sack the Thrall or the Husk? I think I would rather sacrifice the Husk, just to have more fodder for our Yahenni. And Husk is not great against Alchemist's Vial. So let's go ahead and Eldritch Evolution for a Fleshbag here, I think. And attack for 3. And then we can play out the Quagmire, next turn the Thrall. So we are applying a decent amount of pressure here, but the opponent will be drawing a bunch of cards. So if they have some cheap interaction, they could get out of this. A Renegade map from the opponent, not a problem. Another Alchemist Vial, that's also fine. And another Key to the City. Alright, so our opponent is tapped out here. They can't use their Alchemist Vials. So we could hit them for a bunch. And in fact, I think we just activate the Hissing Quagmire. Hit for 8. And then also play the Thrall. And our opponent not having any ways to really use the keys here, unless they want to discard the cards they have in hand, but then they have to pay a whole bunch of mana on their next turn. And it looks like they don't want to use the keys. If they have something like a Languish or Yahenni's Expertise, they could get out of this, since that would still get rid of our indestructible creature. Instead it's a Reverse Engineer, opponent draws 3, but they are facing multiple lethal threats, so they do need a sweeper here, and it looks like they didn't find any. Opponent does have 2 Alchemist Vials they can use, instead they're going for a Tezzeret, the Schemer, which could kill one of our creatures. Instead, the AI wants to make a Cell token that they can then maybe use with the Alchemist Vial, but they're still very much dead to a Hissing Quagmire also getting activated. Let's just make sure. I guess our opponent could technically have a Fog here, since this does make mana of any color. And instead our opponent just uses the Vial, but they are still dead. Alright, I want to thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed this gameplay, and as always, have a nice day.